Thank you all for coming, and I'm hoping you can hear me in the back. Yes? Terrific. All right. So a brown-skinned man gets into a cab and talks in a vaguely British accent. That would be me. If the driver is brown-skinned too, he's often trying, I suspect, to figure out whether we have some sort of affinity. So in the last few months, a Sikh and an Egyptian in New York, two taxi drivers, have both wondered aloud where I was born. So I say, in London. But that's really not what they want to know. What they mean to ask is, of course, where my people come from. Well, I come from two families, as Liaka just mentioned, in two places pretty far apart. By the time I was born, my mother had lived in London off and on since her childhood, but her real home was far away in atmosphere, if not in miles, on the edge of the Cotswold Hills, where she'd grown up on a farm in a tiny, and I have to say, absurdly picturesque village on the border of Oxfordshire and Gloucestershire, within 20 miles of where her 12th century ancestors lived. After the Second World War, she found a job in London in an organization that was working for racial harmony in the British Empire. It was called Racial Unity. And that was how she met my father, who was a law student from the Gold Coast, as Ghana was then called. He was an anti-colonial activist, he was the president of the West African Students' Union, and he was a representative in Britain of Dr. KWAME Nkrumah, who was to lead Ghana to independence in 1957, just a few years after I was born. So you could say my mother practiced what she preached, racial unity. The other side of my family then came from Ghana, more precisely from Asante, and a region in the heart of the modern Republic of Ghana, where he was born in Kumasi, the city that Liaka mentioned, which is the capital of the old Ashanti Empire. My father's lineage could be traced back to an 18th century general, a successful member of the military aristocracy that created the Asante Empire, and his name is one of the names my parents gave me. So one of my names is Akramampim. My book, The Lies That Bind, Rethinking Identity, is full of such family stories because I wanted to explore the ways in which narratives like these shape our sense of who we are. Each person's sense of self is bound to be shaped by his or her own background, but 6 of the chapters of the book are each focused on widely shared identities: gender, creed, country, color, class, and culture. The 5 C's plus G. And the question I ask is, why do they matter? What do they have in common? And my answer to those questions has led me over the years to the picture that has guided me in the explorations that will follow both in the book and in my talk today. So I began my explorations many years ago thinking about race, roughly because I grew up in Ghana and England, and when I came to the United States, I couldn't figure out how people were understanding my racial identity. But when I turned to thinking about nationality and class and culture and religion, which are also sources of identity, and added in gender and sexual orientation, I began to see 3 ways in which all these very disparate forms of grouping people do have some important things in common. The first is obvious once you state it. Every identity comes with labels. So understanding identities requires first that you have some idea about how to apply them, how to put the labels on people. That way, you can decide, you can look for people of a certain identity, if you have a way of deciding how to apply the label, and you can try to decide when you meet somebody whether the label applies. Now, not everybody agrees about the boundaries here very often. For example, can a Muslim really be French? But there's usually some consensus about some central cases. Nobody doubts that President Macron is French. Well, nobody sufficiently informed to be entitled to an opinion on the matter. A second point is that membership in an identity group matters for its members' emotions and their deeds. It creates what you could call norms of identification, rules about how you should behave in virtue of your identity. And one of the commonest ways in which it matters is that people feel some sort of solidarity with other members of the group. So their common identity gives them a reason, they think, to care about one another and to help one another. And you can all think of examples of identities like that. But just as there's usually contest or conflict about the boundaries of the group, about who's in and who's out, Muslims, French or not, there's always, almost always, disagreement about what significance an identity has. For example, what does being American require of you? I doubt that we could generate an easy consensus on that. There's a third feature all identities share. It's not only does your identity give you reasons to do things, it can give other people reasons to do things to you. I've already mentioned something that identity can make people do. They can help you just because you share an identity with them. But of course, among the most significant things people do with identities is use them on the basis of hierarchies of status and respect and of structures of power. In many places in the world, for example, one ethnic or racial group regards its members as superior to others and assumes the right to better treatment. So to summarize all this in 3 sentences, identities come first with labels and ideas about why and to whom they should be applied. Second, your identity shapes your thoughts about how you should behave. And third, it affects the way other people treat you. And then finally, all these dimensions of identity are contestable. They're always up for dispute. Who's in, what they're like, how they should behave, how you should be treated. And this little theory of identity, which I just sketched, helped me, as I set out, to think about the particular forms of identity that are the main subjects of the book, the ones that I mentioned. Now, long before anyone instructs children to group people into categories, they're programmed to do it anyway. And one of our basic ways of making sense of the world is to form generalizations of the sort linguists call generics, which are generalizations like tick bites give you Lyme disease, or tigers eat people, or President Trump uses a lot of generics. Those generalizations qualify as true. It's presumably true that tick bites give you Lyme disease, but it's actually quite hard to say why. Do you know what percentage of ticks carry the Lyme disease spirochete? Under 2%. So it's true that ticks carry the Lyme disease, but it's also true that most of them don't. And as the philosopher Sarah Jane Leslie has argued, we're more likely to accept claims of this sort, these generic claims, if the property it mentions involves a reason for concern. And Lyme disease is a reason for concern, so we're likely to store away the information. If you didn't already know that, you're probably storing it away. And so things like, being eaten by a tiger mean that if you say tigers eat people, people will store that away. What's more, generics encourage us to think of the class in question as a group with a shared essence. To show how this works, Leslie joined with the psychologists Marjorie Rhodes and Christina Tworek and designed an experiment in which 4-year-olds were shown pictures of a fictional kind of person that they called a Zarpi. These were just children's books, sketches of these sort of non-existent people. Now, the people in the pictures looked male and female, black and white, Latino, Asian, young and old. And here's what they did. With one group of 4-year-olds, the experimenters made lots of generic remarks. They said things like, Zarpies are scared of ladybugs, and so on. With the other group, they avoided generics altogether. Look at that Zarpi. He's afraid of ladybugs, they said. They never said Zarpies are afraid of ladybugs. They said this Zarpi is afraid of ladybugs. A couple of days later, they showed the kids a new Zarpi and said that he made a buzzing sound. It turned out that the kids who'd heard a lot of generics about Zapis were much more likely to believe that all Zapis made a buzzing sound. So generic talk encourages kids to think of Zapis as a kind of person and to think that therefore one Zapi will be like another. So put these two findings together, and it's clear that human beings are more likely to essentialize groups about which they have negative thoughts, spirochetes, being eaten by tigers, and more likely to have negative thoughts about groups that you've essentialized. And that's, of course, an unfortunate vicious circle. So the next time someone tells you that Muslims are terrorists, you might want to bear that in mind. The plain fact is that we're good at conjuring up Zapis and viewing them with suspicion. Here's an example from French history. Take the Cagots of the French and Spanish Pyrenees. Though you've never heard of them, I imagine. Most modern French people haven't either. Though the Cagots largely melted away in the 19th century through migration and assimilation, for a millennium they were treated as pariahs. They were relegated to disfavored districts. They were forced to use separate doors in churches. At churches of this period in France, there are Cagot doors. And they received the communion from the Catholic Church on the end of a stick. The priests wouldn't touch them. Because contact with the Cagots was contaminating, they were severely punished for drinking from the same water fountains as other people. And there are separate water fountains for a Cagot. And they were also not allowed to farm, and for some bizarre reason, they weren't allowed to walk barefoot in the streets. Songs about the Cagot, one recorded in the mid-19th century goes like this in translation: "Down with the Cagot, let's destroy them all, let's destroy the Cagot, down with them all." These songs made it clear how you should regard them, but they didn't tell you why. What distinguished them from their neighbors? Not their appearance. That's why they were forced to wear badges pinned to their clothing with duck feet or goose feet on them, or fabric representations of duck feet or goose feet. Their family names weren't distinctive. Their language wasn't distinguished. They were all Catholics like everybody else except for the Huguenots. The real mystery of the Cagot, as Graham Robb has concluded in his History of France, and I quote, was the fact that they had no distinguishing features at all, and yet for 1,000 years they were pariahs. So we not only belong to groups, we're very easily triggered to take up arms against other groups in ways that are completely bizarre and mysterious. Evolutionary psychologists think these dispositions helped our ancestors survive by creating groups that you could rely on to deal with the perils of prehistoric life, including, of course, other groups competing for resources. But these us and them instincts remain, for better or worse, an indelible element of human nature. Now, in this country, in our country today, when we talk about tribal cleavages, I think the first kind we think of is probably race, but we also think next about gender and religion and sexual orientation and the like. But this afternoon, I want to spend some time on a couple of social categories that we typically don't conceive of in these terms, which are important, I think, for our lives. We often diagnose our political polarization as a function of America's original sin and our unresolved problems of racial injustice and inequality. So, along with race and gender and sexuality, let's recognize the importance of our political identities, however: Democrat and Republican, liberal, conservative, moderate, independent. But identity functions too when it comes to a larger and intersecting issue, the cleavages of class and the growing separation of our classes, class segregation. For the past couple of generations, we've been told that the solution to caste-like systems of class hierarchy was what, back in the 1950s, the great British sociologist Michael Young dubbed meritocracy. He invented that word. But there's now reason to worry that the cure has turned into a disease, which is exactly what Michael Young prophesied. Meritocrats, enlisting all the resources at their disposal, now breed more meritocrats. That is, they turn their children into meritocrats. And to the extent that you can predict that disproportionately many of the children of the elite will, and disproportionately many of the children of the precariat will not, achieve a position in the top tier of wealth, power, and privilege, you have something too much like the intergenerational transmission of status that marks a system of caste. Michael Young predicted this, and he lived to see his prophecies come true. Writing at the start of the new millennium, he lamented that educational institutions had been enlisted into a newly calcifying form of social stratification. Quote, "With an amazing battery of certificates and degrees at its disposal, education has put its seal of approval on a minority and its seal of disapproval on the many who fail to shine from the time they are relegated to the bottom streams at the age of 7 or before." He was talking about the British public exam system. "What should have been mechanisms of mobility have become fortresses of privilege." Yet if a new dynastic system was taking shape, you might conclude that meritocracy has faltered because we aren't meritocratic enough. You would seek to push more rigorously for merit, making sure that every child has the educational advantages and is taught the social tricks that successful families now hoard for their children. So isn't that the right response? Well, not according to Michael Young. He saw that there would be a problem even if the top class didn't exploit its advantages to give their children chances that were denied to others. A system of class filtered by meritocracy would still be a system of class. It would involve a hierarchy of social respect, granting dignity to those at the top, but denying respect and self-respect to those who did not inherit the talents and the capacity for effort that, combined with proper education, would give them access to the most highly remunerated and respected occupations. Class identities in a meritocracy reduce people, in a sense, to a single measure of worth, Michael Young worried. And only someone with a very limited vision could suppose that the worth of a human being reduces to a single measure. Each of us, after all, comes equipped with different talents and is born into different circumstances. And because people choose their own projects, each of us faces his or her own challenge, one that is, in the end, unique. Nobody is doing the things you're trying to do with the resources you have. Nobody else in the world is facing the same challenge as you. This means that there's no sensible answer to the question whether one person meets her challenge better than another. Did Bertrand Russell have a better life than Mozart? The only sensible question is that Russell was a better philosopher and Mozart was a better musician. I know what it is for my life to go better or worse, but it doesn't make sense to ask whether my life is better than your life. Indeed, because each of us does face a distinct challenge, what matters in the end is not how we rank against others at all. We don't need to find something we are the best at. What is important is simply that we do our best, a best defined by our challenges, by who we are. And since we're all different, being the best is different for every single person. Being the best Mary is different from being the best Martha. The ideology and the mechanisms of meritocracy then can lead us to confuse, I think, two different questions. One's a matter of efficiency. The other is a question of human worth. If we want people to do difficult jobs that require talent, education, effort, training, and practice, we're going to need to be able to identify and incentivize candidates with the right combination of aptitude, appetite, and application. So we're going to design schools and universities and select people to fill the places in them. And if the institutions work properly, they aren't merely handing out credentials, which is always a danger, they're building human capacities. We then allow for entrepreneurship, social and commercial, and we offer jobs with salaries and other advantages, interesting work, respect and autonomy in your job, vacations, pensions, healthcare, and we select people to fill them as well. If the principles of selection have been reasonably designed, we can say, if we like, that the people who meet the criteria for entering the schools or getting the jobs merit those positions. This is, to enlist a piece of useful philosopher's jargon, a matter of institutional desert. People deserve these positions in the sense in which people who buy winning lottery tickets deserve their winnings. They got them by a proper application of the rules. Institutional desert, however, has nothing to do with the intrinsic worth of people, any more than lottery winners are people of special merit, and people who don't do well in lotteries are somehow less worthy. Even if we're going to reward hard work, the capacity for hard work is itself the result of natural endowments and upbringing. So neither talent nor effort, the two things that would determine rewards in the world of the meritocracy, neither of these is something you earned. So the lives of the less successful are not less worthy, but not because they are as worthy or more worthy. There's simply no sensible way of comparing the worth of different human lives. So here I think is a better picture. Money and status and social rewards that can encourage people to do the things that need doing can be used that way. It'll be a matter of luck whether you inherit the capacities whose development will be rewarded in the society into which you are born, and of more luck whether the capacities you actually develop turn out to be highly rewarded. You can respond to messages from the market and seek training, of course. And a well-designed society will elicit and deploy developed talent efficiently. But none of this makes it acceptable to have class identities that belie the basic moral equality of human beings. Yes, we want the best for our kids, but we shouldn't secure our children's advantages in a way that denies a decent life to the children of other people. Each child should have access to a decent education suitable to her talents and her choices as they develop. Each should be able to regard him or herself with self-respect. Historically, we have used inheritance taxes to help even out opportunities. Further democratizing the opportunities for advancement is something we do know how to do, even if in the current state of politics in this country and in Britain, it's extremely unlikely, I think, that we will do it. But we also need to work on something that I think we don't yet quite know how to do, which is to eradicate contempt for those who are disfavored by this ethics of effortful competition. The goal is not to eradicate hierarchy and to turn every mountain into a salt flat. We live in a plenitude of incommensurable hierarchies, and the circulation of social esteem will always give advantage to the better novelist, the more important mathematician, the savvier businessman, the faster runner, the more effective social entrepreneur. We can't fully control the distribution of economic, social, and human capital or eradicate the intricate patterns that emerge from all these overlaid grids. But we don't have to continue to produce the injuries of class. And it remains an urgent collective endeavor to revise the ways in which we think about human worth in the service of moral equality. Our failure to do so has had larger consequences in the political realm. At the same time, the lesson of identity theory is that the realm of culture and politics isn't simply reducible to the economic. And so it's important to take into account a phenomenon I didn't discuss in my book, namely those political identities that I mentioned a little while ago. Last summer, the Washington Post published a picture of two men at a Donald Trump rally whose matching T-shirts read, "I'd rather be a Russian than a Democrat." It was a jibe that spoke to our moment. The Republican brand used to be pointedly anti-Russian. In the Trump era, you can be a Republican Russophile for whom Putin is a defender of conservative values. American politics, it has become plain, is driven less by ideological commitments than by partisan identities, less by what we think than by what we are. Identity precedes ideology here. Now, for political scientists, this isn't news at all. They've long been busy investigating our tribal political tendencies. As Jim Gimple at the University of Maryland once put it, party identification is not opinion, it is identity. And the same goes even for supposedly ideological identifications. In research that was published earlier this year, his colleague Liliana Mason conducted a national survey that determined where people stood on various hot-button issues: same-sex marriage, abortion, gun control, immigration, healthcare, the deficit. Then they were asked how they felt about spending time with a liberal or with a conservative, or about becoming friends with a liberal or a conservative, or about marrying a liberal or a conservative. People's ideological animus, the study found, wasn't actually predicted by their opinions, by their answer to those questions about same-sex marriage, abortion, gun control. It was best predicted by what label they embraced: conservative or liberal. Mason calls this identity-based ideology as opposed to issue-based ideology. Other researchers in political psychology refer to affective polarization. But each of these formulations is just a polite way of saying that political cleavages are not so much about "I disagree with your views" as "I hate your stupid face." You can be an ideologue without ideology. Experiments suggest that partisan in-group preferences are extremely powerful. Americans are in fact more polarized by party than by race. Indeed, while few Americans are still bothered by interracial marriage, recent surveys find that between 30 and 60% of people who identify as Democrats or as Republicans want their kids to marry within the party. That's more than the number of people who want their kids to marry within the race. And this is a feature of people more than politics. So think again about those T-shirts. "I'd rather be a Russian than a Democrat." It's easy to assume that the great majority of Republicans who now support Trump are drawn to all his noxious views, and easy to forget that among the candidates who led in the Republican primaries, his percentage of the vote was the lowest in nearly half a century. Tribes come to rally behind their leaders, and partisan identification wouldn't be so stable if we didn't allow for a great deal of ideological flexibility. That's why rank and file Republicans could go from "we need to stand up to Putin" to "why wouldn't we want to get along with Putin" in the time it takes to say "Trump's in, Rubio's out." So what can we do to take advantage of our tribes without succumbing to the debilitating effects of tribalism? Well, for the citizens of every divided nation, one of their identities is the national identity. And the theory of democracy is that we, the people, all of us, are charged with directing the ship of state together. Democracy isn't about majorities winning and minorities losing. It's supposed to be a system in which each of us takes responsibility for contributing to the nation's collective welfare, to the welfare of us all. As John Rawls argued, we need to recognize that our fellow citizens, with their differing conceptions of the good life, must nevertheless treat each other as free and equal persons and offer terms of social cooperation that all of us can endorse. A democratic compact requires us to secure for everyone, not just for our own tribes, the rights enunciated in the Universal Declaration or in the Bill of Rights: freedoms of speech, religion, and assembly, the right to petition the government, equal protection of the laws, regardless of race, and so on. If you think, as those guys in their T-shirts pretended to think, that you'd rather abandon the nation than allow it to achieve some of the aims of the other tribe, you are not in the democratic compact at all. And I'm pretty confident that those guys are, in fact, still in the compact, despite the T-shirts. They were just a provocation. In pretending to reject our compact, they only succeeded in reminding us of it. They care about America, and thus about Americans, even when they affect to despise many of us. So what can we do to stick to the compact while caring for our own tribes and their common projects? Well, social psychology teaches us that that bigotry towards members of one's own community is something that can be both created and destroyed by the circumstances in which people live together. Long ago, the psychologist Gordon Allport argued for what's called the contact hypothesis. Roughly, it says that contact between individuals of different groups makes hostility and prejudice less likely if it occurs in a framework that meets a few important conditions. Crucially, it must be on terms of rough equality, and it must be in activities where shared goals are pursued in the context of mutual dependence. That's one reason why Americans' racially integrated armed services turn out to produce people who are less racist on average when they leave than when they arrive. It's this that makes the segregation of communities within a single society potentially so disastrous, because segregation makes it unlikely that children will meet and collaborate, acquiring the experience of mutual reliance on terms of rough equality. Now, we can do something about this if we want to, by desegregating our communities and our schools. And Americans are used to thinking that we ought to do this in the face of the challenges of our racial divisions. But our political tribes are increasingly segregated too. So we need to find more spaces where people of our dominant political tribes build the social trust that allows diverse tribes to cohabit while continuing to disagree about important matters. We need to be in conversation with one another across all our differences. Here's a small fictional example that exemplifies what I mean. In the final episode of the first season of the British television series Skins, which is about a group of students in England, there's a scene at a birthday party in which one of the characters, Anwar, an English teenager of South Asian ancestry, whose father is a devout Muslim, is talking to his best friend, Maxi, who's white and gay. And Maxi has been waiting for Anwar to tell his parents that his best friend is gay, which Anwar is not, and Anwar has been afraid to do this. After all, his father's a devout Muslim. So Anwar's father comes out and invites Maxi in and asks him why he's out there. He says, my wife made that curry you really like. Why are you not eating it? And as Anwar's father talks, Anwar in the background finally said, okay, Dad, Maxi's gay. And there's this long silence while Anwar waits anxiously to hear what his father will say. And then Mr. Corral says this: it's a stupid, messed up world. I've got my God. He speaks to me every day. Some things I just can't work out, so I leave them be, okay, even if I think they're wrong. Because I know one day he'll make me understand. I've got that trust. It's called belief. I'm a lucky man, right? Come, Maxi, the food is ready. This is how we are with people who are in conversation with one another. Mr. Corral belongs to the Muslim tribe. Maxi's tribe is Christian or perhaps post-Christian, but they don't have to agree. They have only to accept each other, and they can do that without a theory or a principle, because being together, as they have been, has generated commitments that can transcend even serious disagreements. This kind of what I call cosmopolitan cohabitation is something we all know how to do. After all, we're doing it, most of us, in our families. Our families contain people who disagree with us about something. But we're only going to bother to take this step if we're in conversation with one another. And that means we have to share our thoughts about the things we agree about and about the things we disagree about big things and small things, about football, well, maybe you think that's a big thing, about television shows and movies and the gossip about people at work. Mr. Corral begins, I think, in exactly the right place with an admission that he can't work out everything. The world is hard to understand, and he may not be right about everything. He doesn't abandon his belief that homosexuality is wrong. He lays it aside as something to work out later. Right now, what matters is celebrating his son's 17th birthday with his son's best friend. That works in practice. It does not need a theory. I am a philosopher. I like theories. But theory isn't the only thing that matters. To accept the ways in which all politics is identity politics is to recognize that high-flown ideas, including our moral commitment to equality, don't matter until they come down to earth. Right now, we need to find ways to draw on our non-partisan identities as Americans, as citizens of particular communities, as members of churches and synagogues and mosques, to combat the tribalism that is undermining our democracy. For a better or worse, it is only through identities that ideas can change the world. Maybe someone could put that on a t-shirt. Thank you very much.